and glad to see Tonya as always. She is the Hardin Chair of Excellence at the University of Memphis Department of Journalism and Strategic Media. She has been a former bureau chief of the Chalk Beat. She's a former Florida Times Union columnist, a former graduate teaching assistant at the University of Florida College of Journalism, and she is an alumnus of William M. Raines High School in Jacksonville, Florida.
Get your
That,
bond, baby.
amen. That will get us a lot of views and a lot of likes. I can tell
Get
you.
your bond.
Thank you for taking time out of your schedule here to join us today, Tonya. Let's get right to it. One of the things that's happening today is, of course, online viewing. Being online is everything. So, as far as you've been able to see, how has online viewing affected the views of today's news watcher? How's it affected it? How's it affected and how's it affected the industry?
Um, it's affected the industry in ways that maybe we didn't anticipate it. We kind of learning things as we go along, but just but just speaking from what I'm seeing and everything, a lot of the online viewing, um, in many ways has kind of hurt our industry from the standpoint of there's so many people now with a platform. And to be quite frank with you, not everybody needs a platform. The online media and online viewing kind of hurts in the sense that a lot of the people who are viewing things online don't have basic media literacy, which is something we should really be talking about in schools right now. Although in this climate, it may be difficult to get people to do that, but that's extremely important for us to preserve our democracy. And the thing that people should know about us, and I mean, and all these obituaries about mainstream media are premature. I'll just say that there are many people, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these news organizations, they get a lot of views and they get a lot of credibility, and they still are standing strong. The organizations that are hurting a little bit more the local news organizations, which is why we have, a lot of nonprofits, and we have a lot of emphasis now going into bolstering online news, not for profit. The last organization I worked for, Chalkbeat Tennessee, which was a wonderful online organization, news organization that I worked for that focused strictly on education news, was a wonderful organization to work for. And the reason why it worked out so well was because we tapped into the fact that one of the things that local newspapers and local for-profit news organizations were missing out on and couldn't cover as much was education. Because see, in the last few years, what's happened, and one reason why you see so much migration to online in many instances is because newspapers, regular news, for-profit newspapers, so to speak, they have cut staff so much that they just damage their product. I'm just saying they just damage the product. So certain things that you would get online, you would get like substantive coverage on education, beyond something like revolving around a scandal or breaking news, but just the in-depth kind of things about how policies affect kids. At the end of the day, what kids are being affected by these policies, what impact it's going to have on society. Mainstream news, local news, that's for profit doesn't do that anymore. But you have nonprofit news organizations like Chalkbeat and others that are stepping in to fill that void. The only problem is, you have to raise money for it, and you have to find philanthropists to help you raise money for it. And they've been very successful at doing that, in various markets and stuff. But that's the thing about it. Getting back to how it's affecting online viewing. Online viewing, I would like to say that it's led to people being more educated and being more astute about what's going on in the world around them. But in fact, unfortunately, I fear that it's had the opposite effect because a lot of people can't tell the difference between news, opinion, where they're getting the news from. Are they getting it from some influencer, and then see the thing about a lot of these influencers that get paid to say the stuff they say, most of them sound very convincing, but a lot of them just lie. I mean, they're just telling lies. For example, there's a viral video going on right now that I'm sure some people think is true. Well, a woman is saying that Harriet Tubman was a real person. Can you believe that somebody believing Harriet Tubman wasn't a real person? And the evidence they had, or another person who said that that she's not a real person because they said they had an underground railroad. And they said, well, who was digging underground tunnels? Well, you know, and I know, if you know anything history, we wasn't talking about an underground tunnel. That's just what
Right.
they called it. Because
Right.
they had people in the dark of night, you know, she was taking people out of slavery. But see, unless you have history and context, and you're dealing with people who don't have that history and context, and we haven't been teaching history in the schools, we haven't been teaching civics, thanks to No Child Left Behind, they'll take that and run because the people who saying that, they sound like they know what they're talking about. But I'm looking at it and saying, no, 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 no. But you know, so that's another thing that's kind of hurting. I think that but I think that when you have more online news organizations like Chalkbeat, here we have an online news organization called MLK 50, which is run by it focuses strictly on social justice issues. It's been very successful. It it was founded by a former colleague of mine, Wendy Thomas, who's a columnist at the Commercial Appeal before I was. And she got so frustrated with the industry till she started her own news organization, and it's going strong. They've won all kinds of awards because they write about things and they do investigations that the Commercial Appeal and other, you know, for paid news don't have the time to do, or they don't want to spend the money to do, or they're so short staffed till, you know, you may be working on one thing, you may be working on an investigation, but they may pull you off of that, you know, all the time to cover the police, to cover something over the holidays, to respond to things because they don't have enough people working is a problem. So that's the kinds of things. So those are the challenges that people have, and it's harder for readers to understand. What we need is just more emphasis. If there was any way to do it in schools, it'd be great on media literacy. Where are you getting this information from? Does this person know what they're talking about? Half the time, it's people who say they don't know it, they don't have a clue as to what they're talking about, and I believe that hurt during the election because I mean, if you recall, there was so much emphasis on Kamala Harris and whether or not, you know, she was about her heritage and stuff. And that issue wasn't really important at all as much as it was policy and things. But that kept overwhelming the news. And unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream news organizations, when they want clicks on their articles, sometimes they pursue the stuff that's more sensational instead of the stuff that, you know, that people need to know. I mean, there's a journalism professor. His name is Jay Rosen. Okay. He said something that was so profound and it's stuck in my head ever since. During the election coverage, he kept saying that news media organizations were focusing too much on the odds and not the stakes. And he was absolutely right. You know, they didn't talk about the stakes because it was easier to pay these pollsters to keep doing these polls every day. And people, oh, what they say in the polls about Biden, Trump, Harris, Trump, and stuff, instead of talking about the stakes. What are their policies? How is this going to hurt you? What does America have to risk if they put a felon in office? You know, that wasn't talked about enough. That wasn't talked about enough because, you know, readers, you know, were following the things that were fed to them, and they were following the odds and not the stakes. Had there been more reporting on the stakes, we might have had a different outcome. We might
Yep.
have.
Yep. I must admit that I'm one of those, you know, there's still a news junkie, and one of the benefits, of course, of online viewing of news is that I can now, you know, I can read 10 page
Yeah, yeah,
10,
yeah,
10
yeah.
news papers within
Mhm.
the course of my morning, and over the coffee and at lunch. I can go from the time from the
My boyfriend's a news junkie too, and it's
yeah,
and I love all the news junkies. The
yeah.
difference between you and people coming up now is that you read the news. You older, I'm older. We read it with a sense of context. You know, when
Hmm.
they say something like, if somebody if an influencer goes online and says that we didn't need school integration because who said that a black child is going to learn by sitting by a white child? We know that's not how that whole thing started. But
Hmm.
somebody who doesn't know the history of civil rights and stuff, they don't know that, you know. They are saying, yeah, you're right, you know, because it sounds simple enough. It sounds like ridiculous that somebody would think that, you know, a black child would learn just by osmosis sitting next to a white person. But we know the history behind it. And we know that's not how that started. That's the danger, is that it's a lot of people who look at news with no context. And that's made, and because people don't have the historical knowledge, that's made them vulnerable. You know, people who go and do podcasts, some not you, some do podcasts, and
Right.
some, you know, have followers online and everything. Like you have all these conservative influences who tell people what they want to hear or don't help them understand the complexities behind stuff. A lot of people are look for, people have always done this, but it's really bad now where people look for simple answers, to complex problems. And they make it worse, because a lot of people read those things, read news, and and they come to conclusions. I'm thinking, how did you come to that conclusion reading that? That's not the story behind that. And you have to tell them, that's no historical knowledge, no civics education. That's what we're seeing right now. And I have to say this too, I'm even seeing it in the students I teach. I was kind of blown away when I was teaching, when I was teaching just this past semester. I was teaching media writing. That's like the introductory journalism class. And I was surprised at the students who don't read news. They're in news, but they don't read news. I mean,
Yep.
seriously.
Yep.
One of my students dropped the class because he was upset because he failed a news quiz.
Well, I can understand that.
Yeah,
Most people, and young people in particular today are doing a lot of that. They want to follow what they like or
yeah, yeah, mm,
what is in line with what their thinking is at the
yeah,
time.
yeah,
If
mm,
it's not in line with my thinking, I'm not going to read that.
yeah, yeah,
And for young people, if it's not fun or again the same thing, if it's not in line with my interest, I'm not going to follow that. And it's unfortunate that you got students in journalism who don't follow the news.
yeah. Well, here's the thing about that too. Another thing that makes me lament the days when, we had newspapers, people who you got the newspaper first thing in the morning, or your regular local broadcast and your nightly news is that even if you just like sports or you just like entertainment, before you got to the sports and entertainment, you at least had to watch the regular news first.
Right,
That
right.
kept people moderately informed. If
Mhm.
when I was working at the new when I was working directly in newspapers, the front page news was A1 news. That was national news. That was really important local news, all those things. So the main things you at least knew about because you saw that because you had to at least come across that before you turned to the sports section of the comics. So everybody at least knew. But now when people can pick and choose and they can skip over all of that. If you're just interested in sports, that's all you look at. If you're just interested in celebrity news, that's all you're going to, if you're just looking at gossip, and TikTok videos, that's all you're going to know. I mean, that's the kind of things. And so a lot of people are just horribly, horribly uninformed. Case in point, if you need any evidence of that, the week of the election, there were people Googling, the biggest Google search was whether or not Joe Biden had dropped out. This was the week of the election.
Oh
I mean, it
my
was.
goodness.
So, I mean, Joe Biden, then you had after they started hearing about tariffs and how they can increase prices, everybody's searching about tariffs. Well, everybody was telling y'all about that, but until it became at the top of the news and was seemed to affect their life in some way. That's when they looked at it, it was too late. See?
Now, and on that note, I want to ask this question. What are the top issues, and you've almost answered it, but
Yeah.
let's say, what are the top three issues that you're following? You're not doing as much journalism these days, you are teaching it, but basically, if you're teaching it and trying to get folks to understand, you're still in journalism. What are the top three issues that you're watching or covering?
Okay, well, one of the top issues, obviously, is just the chaos that this administration is creating in virtually every sector of society, and how that's, I'm into the top issue I'm looking at is the health of our democracy. I'm probably going to start back writing more columns because in this job I have to publish, and I just haven't done. I'm just getting used to the teaching this because this was my first year. I just taught for 2 semesters, but I'm going to jump back into writing and stuff. But I'm really interested in how democracy is being impacted by what's going on right now. So that's a top issue. I'm especially interested in what's happening, to university education and what's happening to the sciences and stuff, and how that affects communities, especially communities of color. Not to mention, just the war against diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's part of what I'm going to talk about in my book a little bit because a lot of people may not be aware of this. And I think it's time that some journalists, which will probably be me, brought that to people's attention. What we're seeing now is something is an experiment that's been ongoing since the Civil Rights Act was passed. There's this book called Assault on Diversity. I don't have it; it's in my book back somewhere. But The Assault on Diversity, and this was written in 2003. And it basically is a book by Lee Cocarinos, and I can't think of the other author, but basically it's a book that outlines this organized opposition to civil rights. It's organized by people who hated the Civil Rights Acts and never got over it, and they played a really long game. And what the Assault on Diversity is about is what we're seeing right now, where you have these legal organizations like the Pacific Legal Foundation, all these different organizations that sprang up to basically turn civil rights laws on its head, to make it seem as if white people are the ones who suffering, from all of this stuff. And right now, with people having no context to this history, with people not understanding, and with things not being thoroughly explained to people, they don't know what that is. Part of what that's an issue I'm looking at is, and I'm trying to look for a way to explain this to people in ways that they understand.
Mm,
So that's the thing. That's another challenge with journalism too. We one of the things we don't understand, and one of the things that's becoming very clear to me is that 40 million Americans functionally illiterate. So when I see people talking about oligarchy and autocracy, I'm thinking some people hear you say oligarchy and they think you're talking about old people. I mean, they don't know what you're talking about. So
right.
we so one challenge is we're going to have to figure out how to communicate on a level that people can understand, and even get like a whiteboard or a clearboard and show them how this works and how this is going to affect you. It's a matter of building trust. So that's one issue I'm looking at. The other issue I'm looking at is just youth. What do we do with our youth who now, especially here in Memphis, we have a real bad problem with youth violence in Memphis. Um, Kids who getting shot over stupid things. Kids who, I mean, but it's all linked to poverty here. Memphis has some deep poverty, and a lot of that is linked to just the economic structure here. Places like FedEx, which does pay you well if you can get the hours. That's the catch is you can't get the hours. They'll pay like $17 an hour, but you might have to work like 3 or 4 days a week, So you
Mm.
have parents trying to raise kids on those kinds of salaries, and they have to work 2 or 3 jobs to do it. So while they're working 2 or 3 jobs, guess who's raising their kids? Gang members raising their kids. That's
Really? Even
gang
in
members. Yeah.
2025, gang members are still a big deal there?
Oh, well, before my last big project for the commercial appeal, before I got the job at Chalkbeat, I did a series on youth violence, and that's what I talked to a couple guys, former gang members, who were telling me about how it worked. And they said all they did was they go in these communities, housing projects and things. Kids say, I like your tennis shoes. He said, well, Shorty, just go deliver this package for me and I can get this tennis shoe. I can get you a pair of tennis shoes from that. So they become the role models. I mean, they see these gang members and these gangsters walking around, with nice cars, nice clothes, with women, good looking women, and they think this is what I want. They see that parent who seem to be working 2 or 3 jobs and not getting ahead. That parent looks like a sucker to them. So
Mm.
that's another thing I want to look at. That's an issue I'm looking at in Memphis. And what are we doing about that? What are we doing about those things in Memphis? Youth, I'm concerned about that. That's an issue I'm looking at, but also just the impact that a lot of these policies, which are taking us backward, are going to have on us in the future. What kind of future are the kids in our country going to have? When you've destroyed higher education, when you've destroyed science, when you got basically people who destroy institutions that have really supported everybody, not just African Americans, but everybody. What is that going to even look like? So
In
those.
the time we've got left here, are you seeing a more blended society, or are we still segregated by race and gender and country of origin and religion?
On one level, that's the ironic thing that's happening now. I'm seeing a more blended society on a few levels. Like if you look at television, you see all the commercials with the, mixed race couples and things like that. And I see a lot of mixed race couples. I mean, I think you're seeing some of that, but policy wise, I think there's a real backlash. I think that's kind of backfiring in some ways policy wise, because some people will look at that and think that racism is over and it's not. They think that racism over. But I think as far as it goes socially and as far as if socially, I'm seeing a more blended society, but economically and policy wise, there are many forces that's working, to keep that from happening in a real substantive kind of way.
Very quickly, what's next for Tonya
Me,
Weathers?
well, I'm going to Poynter Institute this next week actually to do this workshop called Breaking into Books. I've been trying to break into books for, well, actually, I hadn't really been trying. It's hard for me to muster the discipline to do it and stuff. But I'm hoping this will give me a push because what's next for me is to finally do this book I've been saying I've been doing for years. And I think, and I'm thinking I'm probably going to do some kind of memoir because one of the stories I think that's untold, and that we haven't focused on enough is people like me, you, who grew up during the vanguard of the civil rights movement. When we first started seeing a lot of the promises of integration take fruition, how do we feel? I mean, what are the things we had to experience, and what are the things, and the fact that, and what does it feel like to be perpetually living in a society where you can't have a rest as a Black person? You have to, there's always barbarians at the gate who are threatened by your progress. How do we ever find peace in a country like that? Every time, we make some steps ahead, we have to deal with these periods of backlash. When does that stop? When does that stop? That's just roughly what I'm saying. But it's going to be something like that. But I want to tell it through my own eyes. Growing up, being born 2 years after Little Rock Nine, was getting beat up and spat on and egged, at the at Central High. I mean, you even told me a story one time about how you got involved in NAACP about the insurance man. And when the white insurance man was harassing your mom about buying insurance, those things that happen to us. And every time we get away from that, there are people who are trying to drag us back into it.